Welcome, my dear colleagues, to our fourth plenary session. Our speaker is Professor Dr. Kimberly and Noels. Dr. Noels, it's really an honor to have you with us. Thank you very much for accepting to be our guest speaker. Let me give you brief information about Dr. Noels. If you're interested, you can find her more detailed biodata on our website. Dr. Kimberly Ann Noels is currently a professor in the social and cultural psychology area of the Department of Psychology, University of Alberta in Canada. Her research interests focus on the interconnections between language learning and use, ethnic identity, and psychological well-being. The interpersonal and sociocultural ecologies within which these psychological processes unfold, and the temporal dynamics by which language development and acculturation occur. The title of her talk today is Self-Determination for Engaged Students and Empowered Teachers. Welcome again, Dr. Noels. The screen is all yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Dr. Erzos. I'm really happy to be here. It's been a long COVID period with very few opportunities to get to talk with other people who share common research interests. And so I'm really delighted to be here today to talk with you. So thank you very much for inviting me and giving me a chance to talk about some of the research we've been doing in my lab over the past little while. So I'm speaking to you today from Edmonton, where it's 6 o'clock in the morning. And Edmonton is in Western Canada, and we're located on Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional lands of many First Nations and Métis people. And their language and culture continues to make our city a vibrant place, along with the many settler languages that have come in the last few hundred years. So it's a real pleasure to talk to you, to bring what our research is showing about language and culture in Canada, and maybe I'll learn a little bit more about what's going on in Turkey with regards to language and culture, and today specifically with English language learning. So without much further ado, I think I even jumped ahead on one of my slides. Oops. Let me just, there we go. So yes, I did want to acknowledge that this is Treaty 6 territory, but I also want to I want to acknowledge my collaborators on the projects I'm going to talk about today. Many of them are my students, and there's a picture of our merry band of researchers down in the bottom corner there back in 2019 when we could still gather together outside. So I specifically want to mention Shelley Adrian Taylor, Katie Chaffee, Ellie Dinsher, Nigel Liu, Josh Katz, Maya Sujita McEwen, Christy Sommer, Dayuma Vargas Lascano, Savash Yeshalyurt, Doris Jung, and Sija Jung, and also my funder, the Canadian government. I'm sorry, I have to get used to the slides. There we go. Okay, so I have four goals today. I'd like to first describe to you a social psychological model based on self-determination theory that can account for learners' motivation for learning languages. And then and as part of that discussion, I want to highlight that there's many, many reasons why people learn and use new languages, and that these reasons are really important for their motivation. And so we should pay attention to them. I'd like to think about how we can communicate with learners in ways that support their engagement in learning and using new languages. And I also want to talk about how we can empower teachers to engage in teaching and to thrive in their profession. So my students tease me that I always use this slide to start my talks, but that's because I really, really think that it is very insightful what I find to be an insightful quote from Bob Gardner, who you all likely know is the grandfather of language learning motivation research. And when he was asked to define motivation, he pretty much threw up his hands and said, you know, when we talk about motivated people, we use so many different terms and there are so many different models that we can use to describe them. So we might talk about them as being goal-directed, expends effort, is persistent, is attentive, has desires or wants, exhibits positive affect, is aroused, has expectancies, demonstrates self-confidence and self-efficacy, and has reasons or motives. And I'm sure in your readings, you've come across many, many more terms that we could use. And so it's such an umbrella concept, motivation, that we really have to narrow our focus down to a few particular pieces of the puzzle. So I don't want to say that the approach that I'm going to present today is the approach. It's one approach that I think is comprehensive and useful, but there are certainly many other insights to be gained by using other perspectives. And what I've been particularly interested in is two parts of Gardner's description of a motivated person. And one is this focus on effort, or the amount, the intensity, the sort of the quantity of energy that we put into pursuing the pursuits that we have. And the other thing is the reasons. So while there's energy and that moves us forward, we can also think of reasons as being the sort of thing that guides that energy in particular ways, or gives that energy a particular kind of orientation, to use Gardner's terms. It sort of sets a frame of reference for understanding the force of that energy. So I have a very basic motivational model to start off with. And this model comes from Ellen Skinner's work. It probably first started getting articulated in the 1990s, and then in the 2000s, it became more and more used, and mostly in educational psychology. But I think it kind of captures a lot of what we think about when we think about motivation. It also, I think, reflects even Gardner's work. It's certainly not the same terms that he would use, but I think you'll see certain similarities in these four grand concepts. And so when we think about motivation, we're often thinking about the person and why they do things that they do. Those are the reasons. And that they engage in particular actions. That's the energy, that's the efforts that they make. And that leads to particular outcomes. And in education, we're mostly interested in academic outcomes, but there's all sorts of other outcomes that I'll talk about. And as a social psychologist, I'm particularly interested in how the social context matters for that energy and that orientation that we have in our motivation. Now, a model like this is very linear. It suggests almost like billiard balls, one bouncing into another in sort of a linear fashion. And I think we've all been affected by the research and theory around complex dynamic systems in second language acquisition research. And certainly in motivation research and psychology, particularly that focuses on education, we recognize that learning is a developmental process. So it isn't, we need to recognize that this is something that happens over time. And moreover, it kind of cycles back on itself. So when we engage in the environment, when we engage in an action and we have particular outcomes like learning a new language, that changes a little bit the social environment in which we live, which in turn affects us all over again. So there's a feedback, an ongoing cycle through these processes. And when we learn new languages, we don't only change our social context, we change ourselves. So even though I'm going to be presenting a lot of correlational data and the models look very linear, in some ways, that's just a limitation of the way in which we present information on a flat surface. And if we could do this three-dimensionally to try and capture that more cyclical motion, it would be really nice. Someday in virtual reality, maybe. Or maybe that's what we're in already. Okay, now I'm going to bring us to a model like this, but I'm going to take us through to this point relatively slowly. And where I want to start is with this idea about what the self is. And of course, the self in language learning research is, it's kind of taken off. There's a lot of theories that focus on the self. Dernier's L2 self-systems model is very well known, and it postulates a number of self-dynamics that might be important in motivation. Bonnie Norton talks about identity and investment, so that's maybe another self model. Self-determination theory also talks about the self, and it's a humanistic theory. So it has the perspective that as humans, we come into the world with some basic needs, and some of them are physical, like the need to eat and sleep and operate in our world, to have security in the world. And some of them are psychological needs. And self-determination theory maintains that we have three basic needs. And to the extent that we have these needs fulfilled, we will have an orientation to what we do in the world that is described as being more or less self-determined. And I'm going to take us through each of those ideas. So the basic psychological needs are competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And so the first assumption is that human beings have a need to feel competent, that they are effective, they can effectively do the things that they need to do and master the challenges that they encounter in their life and be competent people in their world. A second important basic need is this sense of relatedness. And that's a sense of having secure and satisfying connections with other people in our environments. So these two ideas are very common throughout psychology. We can think of Bandura's self-efficacy theory and talking about the importance of competence, for instance. There are many researchers who look at development and talk about the importance of secure connections and attachments to our parents initially or our caregivers initially, but that expands as we grow older and other people those attachments to other people become important later in life. Self-determination theory is different than some of those models because it adds the third component of autonomy, that it isn't enough to just feel like we can do the things we need to do effectively in our environment and be attached to other people, but we also need to feel that we are agents in the things that happen to us, that we can make personally meaningful choices in our lives and pursue things that are meaningful to us. And that when we fill these basic psychological needs, just like the physical needs, when we feel comfortable and satisfied when our basic physical needs are met, when our psychological needs are met, DC and Ryan, the people who have developed self-determination theory, claim that human beings will be able to rise to their full potential, that they can experience personal growth and a sense of thriving and well-being. So psychologically, we'll be healthy as well as physically healthy when our physical needs are met. So that is the assumption of a humanistic theory that centers self-determination theory. And so to the extent that those basic psychological needs are met, we have particular orientations to how we engage in activities. And these fall on a continuum. And well, we can broadly categorize them into intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, and amotivation. And so, as I said, they fall in a self-determination continuum, so that Intrinsic motivation is the most self-determined orientation that we might have towards an activity. Amotivation is the least self-determined, and extrinsic motivation falls in between. And I'll take you through each of these. So intrinsic motivation is when we engage in an activity because we really enjoy it. And so you can think maybe about language learning as something that you just get a kick out of. You've always kind of liked language, you liked playing with language, and maybe finding new words in new languages is kind of a fun thing to you. Personally, I'm not a language teacher, I'm a language learner. And so I'm a bit of a geek about languages. I took linguistics, I took communication in my training. I have a spouse that we share this geeky love of looking up strange words and finding out what the origin of them are. So, so that describes an intrinsically motivated. I'm not always intrinsically motivated. Sometimes learning languages is tough, right? But I would say by and large, I tend to be intrinsically motivated. And certainly you can see some students in your classrooms who might be intrinsically motivated. I'm going to bet a good number of people who become teachers are intrinsically motivated, that there's other geeks in this Zoom meeting other than me. And this is one quote from a student that we categorized as being by and large intrinsically motivated. And so this person said, I love learning new things and I've always been fascinated by East Asian languages. I love Japanese and linguistics. And so when I had an opportunity to try studying Chinese, I jumped at the chance. The sense of accomplishment, the feeling of pride I have when I grasp a difficult concept, and the excitement of being able to speak and understand a foreign language are what keep me motivated. It is wonderful to learn and grow and see your progress. And another person, this is just a snap from their written response on a questionnaire. Why are they learning Japanese? To experience the culture. I love it. The little heart sign. Now, we hope to have those students and we hope to help keep them intrinsically motivated as we teach them. But we also have students at the other end of the continuum, students who just don't see the point of learning languages. It's not interesting to them. They'd much rather be doing something else. They can't see the value in learning a language. And that's fair enough. This is an example of a student who we categorized as being amotivated. So the main reason for me to be in Chinese class is so I can finish my degree. When I signed up for this program, now they've had a change in their motivation. When I signed up for this program, I was really excited about learning a new language and the culture that goes along with it. But I'm really disappointed in my teacher. She was very tunneled and inflexible in her teaching. She's more concerned about the material to be covered than the well-being of her students, their comfort, and to develop the interest among them to motivate them for language learning. I can't wait to be out of this class. My teacher makes me think twice about continuing my learning of Chinese language. So we're going to put aside the question of what's the teacher's role in this for a moment. But I think you can hear the students' disappointment and lack of having any reason whatsoever for being involved in this Chinese class, except that he needs to get that degree. But even that is sounding like, you know, it's tough to convince himself that that's that valuable. Now, extrinsic motivation falls in between these two extremes. And at the extreme that's closer to that amotivated end is external regulation. So this is when somebody is really, and maybe that example bleeds a little bit into external regulation. So this is when a person is learning the language because they got to get that grade. They got to get, their job requires them to do it. This is a perfect quote. Get a job, general education requirements, mom wants me to. So that job, those general education requirements, they're the carrot. that's driving this person or that's promoting this person's engagement, and mom's the pitchfork pushing them along. Introjected is a little bit more internalized, but it's still about pressure, and it's the pressure we put on ourselves. So we don't necessarily need to be concerned about getting that grade, let's say, but we would feel bad if we didn't do well in the course, because we kind of see ourselves as being, that we should do that. So there's a lot of shoulds in introjected regulation. It's kind of like Dornier's ought self. You really ought to be doing this. And so here, this donkey is motivating itself with this carrot. It's pressuring itself. And so an example here comes from a heritage language learner. So somebody who's learning their family language. I'm tired of people automatically speaking to me in Spanish, and I always have to tell them that I don't know it that well. It embarrasses me, and sometimes it embarrasses them as well. Was so frustrated that I was willing to take the Spanish class without any credits. I plan to go to a class as long as there's an empty seat. So here it's quite clear, like without any credits, it's not the credits that's driving this person, it's this embarrassment that they want to get over. But it's still, you get the sense of pressure. It's not a positive. I don't think any of us want to be learning the language for that reason. As we move up the continuum, we get to identified regulation. And identified regulation is when we've identified, we may not love the language. It may not be the language is that important to us, but the language is a means to an end that is important to us. So an example might be a doctor who is planning to work in a region where there's lots of people who speak a language that the doctor doesn't speak. So in order to be a good doctor, the doctor should learn that language so that he or she can communicate more readily with their patients. So this is an example of an English person who's learning English education. So my major is English education. So in the long run, I want to be a good teacher. And so the first thing I want to do, or first thing I need to do, is studying and mastering English. So the goal is to be the teacher. And in this case, it happens to be an English teacher, so it's a little more complex, but you can imagine someone wanting to be a primary school teacher in a place where lots of, an English person in Southern California, for instance, and there's lots of Spanish speakers there. So to be a good teacher, they should learn Spanish, similar sort of idea. And finally, there's integrated regulation. And this is the point where you're not learning the language because you love it, but it has become such a part of you that it's completely enmeshed in your other aspects of your life and your values. And when you're using the language, when you're engaged in the activity, it's kind of an expression of who you are. And again, I'm going to bet that there's a lot of people in this Zoom call who probably are at that point where English is just another facet of themselves, and it's fully integrated into their sense of self, or more or less integrated into their sense of self. So just, I have an example here of ESL, we can think the same for EFL, that on this self-determination continuum, at the one end, the language and the self are completely separate from each other. But at that more self-determined end, when we're learning it because we ourselves have chosen to learn the language and it's part of who we are and what makes us tick in the world, that's greater self-determination. So these reasons are an important point that I want to make with this one study I want to tell you about is that so I've presented it here. I've given you examples of people who kind of characterize different orientations. But really, we all can have many different reasons for learning a language. So if you're registered in a language class and an exam is coming up, even if you're generally intrinsically motivated, that exam sitting on the horizon can seem like a big external regulator, right? You have to do the work in order to meet that exam. So when we looked at students in university students in language classes, we found that they actually tend to give more than one reason why they're in their language classes. We also, I also want to emphasize in this slide that the learning context matters for which reasons tend to predominate. So in this study, we looked at, we gave open-ended questionnaires to people in language classes, equal numbers of students who were in an ESL class. So these were international students who'd come to Canada to learn English. We had heritage language speakers, so people who were learning, who were registered in university courses, modern languages like Spanish or German or French, and they were learning a language that was a familial language, so either their parents or their grandparents had spoken the language, but they were learning it. And then modern language students or foreign language students, so these would be mostly English speakers who were learning, for instance, German or Spanish, and in Western Canada, French, even though it's an official language of Canada, there aren't many francophones. So it's kind of a foreign language. And when you can see, just looking at the bars on the graph, that there's a little bit of different things going on for the different groups. So when we look at external regulation, like doing it for the grade, for both the ESL students and the modern language students, this stands out as one of the reasons that they're learning the language. But for the heritage language students, even though they're in a language course, this wasn't a particularly prominent theme for them. And the same was true for the other kind of pressure-controlled orientation of interjection. The ESL and the modern language students felt themselves giving themselves pressure to learn the language, but the heritage learners did not. Most of the students saw the value of learning the language for something they wanted to achieve or in their lives. But what's really interesting, and I've circled it here, is the integrated regulation. So for the heritage language learners who are learning a familial language, it is indeed very much integrated into who they think they are. Whereas for the second language learners and the modern language learners, this is not a very prominent theme at all in their responses. I want to point out the intrinsic motivation as well. Intrinsic motivation isn't particularly high, but it is higher for the modern language students and less so for the ESL students. And you can imagine that students that are living in a community where they have to, where it's really an imperative that they speak English and they speak it now in order to do their everyday things, that they're not just learning the language for the fun of it. It's a very pragmatic thing, and sometimes it's probably not a lot of fun. And finally, we do have the integrative orientation here. So those of you familiar with Bob Gardner's work will recognize that as the need or the desire to want to have contact with the target language community. And you can see that the heritage language learners, of course, it's their family. The target language community represents their ancestry. So they're strongest here. And the modern language students are the weakest, in fact, and perhaps that's because they don't have access to the target language community. So that talks about the aspects of the self. And now I want to turn and talk about how those reasons are important for our engagement or for learners' engagement. And when we get to this point, this is really going back to that idea about motivation having both a qualitative part, an orientation, and then that intensity part, that engagement. So this was a study that we looked at, and I want to highlight this study because while it emphasizes that there is an association between your orientation and how engaged you are, and the intensity of that engagement, it's a little more complex than being quite that straightforward. So this is a study of generally English speakers in Canada learning French. And we looked at this longitudinally. So we looked at it at the beginning of the semester when they started their language class, at the midterm when they were just finishing their midterms exams and going on break, and then at the end of this semester when they were at just before final exams. And as with any longitudinal study, there was a lot of attrition, and this is a small sample, so I want you to bear that in mind, but I think it still gives us some interesting findings. I won't go into these too much. This is just the items that we use to measure the different orientations. So we looked at all of those orientations that I described, from enjoyment to learning French, to doing it in order to get benefits, to doing it because it's an important part of who they are. And we looked at their motivational intensity through questions like asking them to tell us how much they agreed with statements like, I keep up to date with French by working on it almost every day. So somebody with high intensity would work on it a lot. And this is some of the data. This is 15 people and their trajectories over the semester. And there's a couple of points I want to make here. And the first one is that you can see a lot of variability. So that red line in the middle is the mean, it's the average. But you can see that there are people who are really, this is particularly intrinsic motivation. There's some people who are really intrinsically motivated and some people who are not so much. So down at the bottom, not so much. And there's some people that are going down in their intrinsic motivation, and there's some people who are going up, and there's some people who are staying the same. The general tendency, though, statistically significant tendency, is for intrinsic motivation to increase over the semester. So people start to enjoy learning their language as they go along. Probably they get settled into their course, they make friends with their classes, they get to know their teacher. So overall, their intrinsic motivation, it gets more fun. This is engagement. This is the intensity of effort they put into it. And you'll see that these are university students. In general, they're putting in quite a bit of intensity, but again, there's variability, and some people stay pretty constant, but there's a slight tendency to go downwards. So over the course of the semester, people start to stop being engaged a little bit. Their intensity drops. And this finding is actually consistent across a lot of motivation research and across different time periods. So across a semester, across an academic year, sometimes across for instance, across the period of high school. So across years, we see declines in the engagement going down over time. But this is a bit curious because if our intrinsic motivation is going up and you're liking it more, why are you engaged why on average are people engaging in it less? That's a really curious question. So we did parallel growth curve modeling to look at this. And what this analysis allows us to do is not just look at the correlation between intrinsic motivation and engagement, but also to look at the relationship between those two slopes. And indeed, I won't go into the details here, but indeed there is a correlation between intrinsic motivation and engagement. More intrinsic motivation, more engagement. But there's also a relationship between the path that intrinsic motivation goes up and that tendency to go down. And I'll explain it by talking about Alan and Betty. So Alan is in yellow and Betty is in orange. And what we see is that with Alan, even though he's average intrinsic motivation, he's pretty flat over time. He doesn't change very much. But what you see with Alan is that his engagement drops. So he's not feeling any increase in enjoyment in learning the language. And so he's declining in his engagement. Betty, on the other hand, even though she starts with much lower intrinsic motivation, her intrinsic motivation rises. She starts to enjoy her course more and more and more. And what happens to her engagement is that it sort of plateaus. She doesn't engage any more, any less, importantly, any less by the end of the semester. So it's not that intrinsic motivation is just going to, everything's just going to keep going up. There's lots of reasons people put the brakes on at the end of a semester. They're tired, they're worn out, they're thinking about transitioning to other things, other courses. It's time to come to the end of your coursework and just focus on that final exam. But if people's intrinsic motivation is increasing, they're going to be inclined to keep up that energy as they go along. So I've talked now a bit about those self dynamics and how they relate to that action component. I'm just going to mention a few things here, is that from a self-determination perspective, a lot of motivation research really just focuses on language proficiency, and the kinds of outcomes that we're interested in motivation is how much does motivation contribute to language proficiency? And usually we talk about that in terms of grades, but from a self-determination theory perspective, we can be interested in things that aren't just the language proficiency per se. And there is consistent research to show that more motivation is linked to greater proficiency. But there are other things as well, like having engagement with the target culture. And that might be in an EFL context through social media or other avenues if there's not face-to-face communication. It might be greater willingness to communicate. It might be more of an identity with that culture. So that's the sociocultural outcomes that can be important. Also important are the psychological outcomes, and that goes back to that idea of personal growth and well-being and thriving. And so that support of those basic fundamental needs and the self-determined engagement in the activity of language learning would be related to those well-being and thriving as well. So if all these good things come out of it, how do we promote people's competence, relatedness, and autonomy? Well, lots of people can be involved. The teacher is clearly the person we're talking about today a lot, but family members also play a role, parents, peers, depending on the age of the learner. It could be siblings, it could be spouses, and the target language community, of course. If there's access to interactions with the target language community, they can be important too. But let's look at the teacher. And I want to show you some data from Turkey on a study that I collaborated with that was led by Ali Dinçer, who looked at this model and found support for the idea that the more that students see their teachers being autonomy supportive, so supporting their basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, the more they were engaged behaviorally, so the more effort they put into their work, the more they were engaged emotionally, the more they liked learning the language, the more they engaged cognitively, so the more attentive they were, the more they reflected on their learning, and then the more agentic they were. And that's that agentic engagement is an interesting concept because it's the idea that the learner will be proactive and reflecting on what they're missing in order to do better, and then go out and try to find ways to improve themselves. So an agentic learner is the student who comes up to you after class to talk to you about what it is that they're missing. Not necessarily the one looking for the better grade, but the one that wants further clarification about what an exercise was about. So instead of just doing the exercise and maybe being very focused on it, but letting it, not necessarily trying to go out and find the answer. And he found that different aspects of engagement in this study were related to grades, especially that agentic engagement and emotional engagement, and also to less absenteeism, so less skipping classes. Okay, so I've brought you all the way to this model that I promised you that I would. Now I want to talk a little bit more about what's happening here, what's going on, especially between the teacher and promoting the students' competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So DC and Ryan argue that if we want to promote other people's autonomy, competence, and relatedness, we have to provide informative feedback, interpersonal immediacy, and autonomy support. And I'm going to talk a bit about each of these, but what I want to underline here is that each of these requires taking the learner's perspective. There's a certain amount of empathy that's required to help promote other people's motivation. And they work together, these aspects. That's the second point. There isn't just one of these that's going to do the trick to promote other people, your students' autonomy. They work together in supportive communication. So what is informative feedback? Well, informative feedback is that part of our feedback that helps promote competence. And that's probably what a lot of us focus on when we're teaching. So do we set clear goals? Do we set clear expectations for learning through our syllabi, our curriculum? Do we facilitate access to learning resources? Do we provide good textbooks or appropriate textbooks or activities and materials that students can use to improve their competence? Do we find challenges to them? So not so overwhelming that they can't do them and so they don't feel competent, but challenging enough that when they do accomplish them, they don't just feel like it's same old, but that they've actually achieved something. And then offering timely and constructive feedback. So while this is fresh in their mind, while they've been doing their exercises and it's fresh in their mind, do they get the feedback then so they can integrate it into their learning? Interpersonal immediacy is that developing of warm and close relationships with your student. So demonstrating interest, respect, and caring about your students and their learning. So it involves allowing a student to develop a positive relationship with you. And I don't want to imply that you have to be friends. And certainly there's differences across cultures in just what it means to develop a warm relationship. In some cultures, it is very friendly and interpersonal, and teachers go and have coffee with their students and what have you. All well and good. In other cultures, it's very different, and teachers may be more distance, but still communicate warmth towards their students. There might still be a bit of a distance between the teacher and the student, but that doesn't mean that it's not a caring relationship or a warm and respectful relationship, an interested relationship. And finally, autonomy support is having the objectives and activity that are meaningful to the student. Not because you as the teacher think they're important for the student to do, but that the student can see why it would be important to do these things. And sometimes it's really hard for students to see the importance. Maybe it's not important to them at all. And really there's nothing, other than explaining why we think it's important and trying to get the students to relate to what we think is important. It may just be that there are some students that just don't find language learning important. Hopefully not, but it happens. And so when we can, providing them with meaningful options about what they can do in their activities whenever possible can be a helpful strategy. More and more there is quite a bit of research in general education around being supporting students' motivation through a self-determination theory lens. But there's even more research starting to come out in the last 5 years where scholars are putting together compendia of what kinds of activities and what kinds of strategies they use, whether it's online, things like blogging to be self-reflective and for students to think about why they're learning the language, whether it's engaging in online activities that are that give them quick feedback on their developing competence, all sorts of strategies like that. And I'm happy to provide a list of the articles that are coming out like that. I want to make a point that whatever curricular or pedagogical techniques and activities and practices we use to support learners' autonomy, competence, and relatedness, I think maybe one of the keys is really about how we communicate with learners. And I think this might be important for teachers to reflect on. Sometimes when I'm talking to teachers, I can't see you now, but sometimes when I'm in a room and I'm talking to teachers about supporting learners' motivation, I can see their faces drop because a lot of them are thinking, oh my goodness, now I've got to think about that. Now I've got to get all these materials together. I got to think about new ways to get my students energized and engaged. And I don't think that's necessarily, I think that's helpful, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think a lot has to do with how you communicate with your students. And that takes work. There's no doubt about it. It takes patience to be empathic and take someone else's perspective. But I think this might be critical. And I want to give you a sense about what autonomy supportive communication looks like through this YouTube video. So it's quite short. Some of you may have seen it. I think it's terribly cute.
4, 5.
No, 1, 2, 3, 4.
No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
No, 1, 2, 3, 4.
No, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
No, that's 1, 2, 3, 5.
No, it's not 1, 2, 3, 5. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
No, that's 1, 2, 3,
How you gonna tell me? How you gonna tell me? I teach this every day. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
No, that's 1, 2, 3, 5.
No, it's not, Aaliyah. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
No, it's 1, 2, 3, 5.
No, sweetie, it's 1, 2, 3, 4.
No, that's 1, 2, 3, 5.
No, no, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
No, that's 1, 2, 3, 5.
Aaliyah, it's 1, 2, 3, 4.
No, Mommy, that's 1, 2, 3, 5.
No, you're skipping 4.
You're skipping 4. You can't just leave 4 out. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
No, that's 1, 2, 3, 5.
No, no, that's not right. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
No, that's 1, 2, 3, 5.
Aaliyah, I'm not gonna keep going back and forth with you. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes.
Yeah. Count
1,
to
2, 3, 5.
It's 1, 2, 3, 4.
No, Mommy, that's 1, 2, 3, 5.
All right, count to 4.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah. You did it.
1,
Point proven.
6, 7, 8.
Yeah.
Okay. I have to smile every time I see
4,
that. She's
5.
just so cute. But the point, what I want to come back with is a question for you all. And that is, how did mom's communication style different from dad's? And what was the impact on Alia's motivation? And I see a hand up from Dr. Erzos. No?
Just to remind you that you need to finish your speech in 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so one thing I think is really important here is that when we watch this film, I think it's really clear that the notion of relatedness is really, really quite evident. Mom and dad love little Alia, and that's I think makes this really heartwarming. But dad has quite a different approach to teaching Alia about numbers. And you can see that dad has figured out what is the right way to count numbers. And he's showing her over and again what his way of seeing things is. And in fact, at one point, you get the sense that he's a very competent number teacher because he teaches this all the time, he says. He must be an elementary school teacher. But Alia, in the face of her dad's sort of controlling behavior, not autonomy supportive behavior, Alia just digs her heels in and resists what he's trying to teach her. So she has it. So the reaction is that, this is a confrontational argument. And what I think is really, and I think that's really interesting, but I think what was particularly interesting here was the contrast with what mom did. So mom took a moment and then looked at things from Alia's perspective and asked and thought about what Alia knows, and then scaffolded her to be able to count the numbers in the way that she knew that Alia knew how to do that. I think there's a few too many she knews there, but so then Alia went 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can see the change in her face. It's much more positive. There's this celebratory moment. And moreover, Aliyah doesn't stop there. She goes on 5, 6, 7, 8 to demonstrate what she can really do. So I really like this little situation in the parking lot to help demonstrate what autonomy supportive communication is like. And I hope, and, you know, as much as it might be important to develop all those other techniques and tools, and I think they're important, that it's that communication that can really foster the learner's autonomy. I think sometimes, and I'm not a teacher, as I've said, but I have wondered, I have heard people say that a communicative language approach tends to be student-centered, and therefore it's probably more autonomy supportive. And that a traditional grammar translation approach is more teacher-centered, and therefore it's probably less autonomy supportive. And I've wondered about that. It seems to me that you could have a teacher teaching a communicative approach, but still have a kind of controlling style. And you could have someone teaching a grammar translation approach who might be more autonomy supportive. And as part of that question, I haven't fully answered it, but we did look at Latin learners. And of course, having a communicative approach in Latin it's happening, but, you know, it's not particularly useful communicative language. People learn it for grammar and translation and reading primarily. And certainly there are autonomy supportive Latin teachers. I leave that to take it as teachers, you know more about this than I do, but I just leave that idea with you, that the teaching style, the communication style is somehow different than the techniques that we use as we teach. But let's not, in all of this, forget the teacher. Who empowers the teacher? And I want to bring us back to our motivational model here, looking at the social context and the self and action and the outcomes. And I want to tell you about a study where we focused on how the social context influences the teacher's self-dynamics, their basic psychological needs, and their motivational orientation, and how that in turn affects their engagement in teaching. And so we did this survey with ESL teachers in Ontario, and they were recruited from an TESOL organization. And this was all done online, and they filled out our questionnaires that looked like those items that I showed you earlier, but adapted, of course, to teaching. And our research, our analyses showed that this basic relationship here, where the more teachers felt that their basic needs as teachers were satisfied, that they felt competent as teachers, that they felt connected to other people in their teaching environment, and that they felt a sense of control and agency in their teaching, that led them to say that they were more intrinsically motivated and that it was more internalized into their self-concept, that they identified value in teaching languages, and that they were therefore more engaged in teaching. So those relationships were solid relationships. Now, who supports the teacher? Where do they get their support? And we thought an important person would be their supervisor. So this could be the TESOL program, the ESL program coordinator. This might be the principal if the teacher was in a school situation. But the person that was closest to them and involved in their teaching, that affected their teaching environment was, and depending on how the teacher perceived their supervisor, if they saw the teacher giving them feedback that was informative for improving their practice, if they were warm and were interested in the teacher's development as a teacher, and if they allowed the teacher if they supported the teacher as autonomous workers, as autonomous teachers, and made decisions about their own teaching practice, then there was a relationship there. Oops. The other people who affect us, of course, are our students. And students might not be able to affect us the same way that our supervisors do, but we certainly recognize when they're engaged or they're not engaged. And so we looked at both student engagement and student disengagement, because when teachers are thinking about the students around them, of course, they have multiple students in a classroom and some are engaged and some aren't engaged. And so we separated those out. And so I've already told you that the supervisor is important for supporting basic psychological needs. We did get a weird finding though. And that was, after we take that part into account, if the supervisor was provided more independence than supported the teacher's basic need for autonomy, if they were too warm and intimate, more than the teacher needed for that sense of relatedness, and if they provided too much information, more than the teacher needed to develop a sense of competence, almost that sense of micromanagement, then that decreased the teacher's sense of autonomy. So this was kind of an unexpected but interesting finding, because it suggests that you can go overboard. So there's an optimum level that might be important. We found that students' disengagement was the most important thing for undermining teachers' sense that they're competent and agentic and that they are liked in their environment. Perhaps not so surprising, but student engagement directly affected teachers' autonomy. So the more students were interested and engaged, or the teacher perceived them to be, the more the teachers felt that they were doing this because they loved it. It energizes us. It makes us enjoy the teaching. So in conclusion, I just hope today that I've been able to tell you a bit about self-determination theory as it relates to learners' motivational processes, and to underline that people have lots of different reasons for learning languages, and that these reasons have important implications for motivation. And as teachers, knowing these different reasons that are at play, and they may be at play at different times in the semester, there's all sorts of complex dynamics that may happen across the whole process of learning, that if we know those reasons though, and we pay attention to them throughout that process, we might be in a better position to support learners' motivation and their basic psychological needs for competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And that same model can be important for supporting teachers. So as supervisors and even as students, as supervisors, we can be more attentive to supporting our teachers. But even as students, as we can think about how we're engaging with other people, that affects them as well. And I will just end with my attempt to say teşekkür ederim, which I'm sure did not come out.
Excellent. You did a great job. Biz teşekkür ederiz. Çok teşekkürler.
Thank you very much for listening.
Well, it was a great session. There are some questions. I do appreciate this highly informative, very, very inspiring and a talk, and that wonderful video clip that shows how clever mothers are.
Yeah. Thank you so much for
how insistent fathers are. So it's universal, I guess. Thank you very much, Dr. Noels. Hope to see you again sometime in the future.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.